Hi, everyone, and welcome to K8sKoach. I'm Tom McGonagle, and I'm here with Billy Downing, and he's all the way over in Ireland, in Dublin, and I'm in Groton, Massachusetts. And we're here today to talk about networking and the application of tooling like GitHub and GitLab. Billy works at GitLab, and we're going to be talking about agile networking, and we're going to be talking about all sorts of things. And Billy's going to be demoing his infrastructure that he's created around using GitLab for network management, and I'll be kind of showcasing my GitOps idea, and we'll be showcasing that. And without further ado, Billy, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, of course. So, like I said, I'm Billy Downing. I work at GitLab as a customer success manager. But my background is more so I was a network engineer for about 10 years, started out in the military, the Marine Corps, went from there to contracting, different companies, various places, all sorts of different roles. It led me down a path of like network automation, which led me into containers and cloud and Kubernetes, and kind of led me into the more of the DevOps world, and especially with working at GitLab, that entire software development ecosystem. And so now I kind of spend my days helping customers. I work in mostly public sector, but helping customers deploy GitLab and make it more efficient for their environments, or just help them in general with their software development life cycles. And yeah, it's really interesting when I saw you were on the podcast with Packet Pushers talking about GitOps and network automation. It's something that I talk about quite often, trying to bring that DevOps software development experience into a networking environment to kind of share a space for collaboration that all these different disciplines can kind of be a part of in a shared experience. So yeah, a little bit about me, a lot of various tech roles, but yeah, here I am now.
Oh, thank you, Billy. I was curious, what is it about automation that clicked for you? Do you have like a superhero origin story? Do you have, when we discussed this before, I know I said like a leadership superhero story, but I guess I'm asking two questions. What is your superhero power? And then what got you into that automation superpower? And so it's really kind of two questions.
Yeah. I thought about that when you asked me that. It's kind of hard. I don't think that I have a superpower really in any specific thing. I think that's what I benefit from is just generally enjoying the problem space that we deal with. Particularly in networking, I just like how tangible things are. When you make changes, they happen immediately. You can watch protocols propagate. The problems that you're solving can be very nuanced and esoteric. And I can just sit down and focus for hours on, the tiniest little detail of something. I used to have this big beanbag in my house, and like I remember just troubleshooting stuff, and I would just be in this giant beanbag for hours, just completely fascinated by something, to the point where even if I didn't do it as a job or a career, I'd probably somehow do it as a hobby or just for fun, so to speak. So yeah, I think it might not be the most flashy of superpowers or origin stories, but I think just being out, especially in the military, out in austere locations where you don't have Google, you don't have help, and you're just kind of sitting there looking at a screen trying to get things to work. You kind of, if you're passionate about it, it's a really good time. If you're not, it could be a very bad time. But yeah, I think that's environment of thrust into the field of networking specifically, and just kind of finding a passion in it is something that I benefit from, I think.
And what was it about automation that really connected? Was it that military austere, forward locations that really kind of connected with you, or is it something else?
Yeah, trying to build something that you can hand off, I think, is what got me really into it. Because I know that especially in networking, or more kind of down in the lower levels of infrastructure, it can be very hard to build something and make it easier to transfer to somebody else without having to explain, you got to do it this way, or these things act like this way. There's all these knobs you can turn and stuff like that. So automation for me was it was kind of a gateway of repeatability, and how I can develop a system that I'm kind of, I know that I developed it in a way that I can hand it off, and someone else can take care of that and have the same efficiencies that I built into it, and improve onto it as well, and extend it into whatever the use case is. So yeah, I think that whole idea of just being efficient with something and creating a repeatability for it to hand it off was what really got me into automation. Because before that, it's a bunch of, or back when I was doing it, was a lot of copy pasting into stuff and handing it over to someone and telling them to read the configuration and figure it out. But yeah, so I think being able to collaborate is probably my gateway into automation and what got me into it.
Well, what I find interesting is, the main kind of selling point for GitOps, and that's Git operations for network automation. It's my kind of project. is the collaboration, right? That's something that I focused on very, very early. It's something I discussed in that Packet Pushers podcast that you mentioned. And it's interesting that you kind of had this similar kind of experience because you're layering on your experience with GitLab, right? And your experience at GitLab, right? So maybe a good segue is maybe I know this is probably pretty hard, but can you articulate exactly what GitLab is and what it provides?
Oh yeah, yeah, and it's funny the collaboration thing. So just from like a company perspective, GitLab has every company has their values, but ours is a credit value. But the C is for collaboration. It's kind of like one of the core values of GitLab is to provide a platform for people to collaborate on building software, building infrastructure deployments, or what have you. So what GitLab is in general is an AI powered DevSecOps platform, and I feel like I have to say the AI powered part just from the buzzword side of it. But no, it's a platform that is backed by Git. It's somewhere where you can store all of your source code. CI is built into it from a pipeline perspective, and essentially think of it like if you're building a platform, you can build a purpose-driven platform. In this case, some sort of software development lifecycle. GitLab is providing you with the different building blocks to do that. So rather than doing all this stuff from scratch and stitching things together, different tools and various ways of doing things, it's kind of the idea of building on top of the shoulders of giants, so to speak. GitLab provides you those building blocks to build an agile workflow for software development or infrastructure management.
So, I'm struck by how common our experiences are. So I use that same term in a turn of phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants, right? So you get with a platform like GitLab, you get the ability to use this really wonderful CI/CD system to manage the deployment of your configs, right? But moving kind of towards the left, towards Git, right? You have this Git sharing platform where you can make changes, you can collaborate. And one of the things that I was always impressed with and really excited about was the network configs could potentially live alongside the application code, right? And if you kind of unwind that a little bit more, what I'm talking about is actually the application developers working with the network engineers, working with the database engineers, working with the security engineer, in this cohesive, multidisciplinary team, right? And that's possible through a sharing tool like GitHub, excuse me, like GitLab or GitHub, right? And so yeah, please.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that the idea of Conway's law, like the organization of your structure dictates the organization of your systems, like in a very high level way. I've worked at a lot of companies where the network engineering team is like a black box where someone just submits tickets to and hope good things happen. And it's not the best way to collaborate because the network engineers don't necessarily know the details of the application. The application developers are just, if they're owning something, they bought off the shelf, they're not quite understanding the services. There are different things the network team is doing. And yeah, exactly to your point. Like it's if you have like embedded engineers and multidisciplinary teams, it's kind of embracing that whole DevOps, not from a role perspective, but from an organizational perspective.
Yeah, it's perfectly put, Billy. Thank you. Something I'd like to do is I'd like to share my GitOps website. And so this is shared via the GitHub Pages project, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share this, and I want to talk about the benefits of GitHub, excuse me, of GitOps, right? And so I think it's this one, yeah. And so I'm just going to share this, and this is gitops.com, and at the top is all the podcasts, excuse me, all the Packet Pushers podcasts that I've been on. And Billy, by the way, I'm going to be on Network Automation Nerds tomorrow. I'm going to be doing a fourth Packet Pushers podcast tomorrow. Are you familiar with that podcast?
Yeah. That's the newer one, right? It just started recently.
Yeah, that's Eric Chu's podcast, and then the fellow that I did the one that you heard, the Total Network Operations, is a guy named Scott Robon, and he's going to be co-hosting that podcast tomorrow. So it's going to be me, Eric, and Scott talking about kind of the basics of Git and CI/CD and DevOps tooling, and we're just going to be going really kind of back to basics. But it should be a good podcast. But as I scroll down, you notice I have this collaborative automation is key. This is on gitops.com once again. And then we keep scrolling down. Here are the benefits, right? And so these are the benefits, and these come from a very, very good book on Chef. Did you ever interact with Chef? You know what I'm talking about, the infrastructure as code tool, Chef?
I'm familiar with it, but it's funny, GitLab uses it extensively. But no, I didn't use it very often, no.
Gotcha. But so, this concept of infrastructure as code is really kind of critical to GitOps, right? So in my GitOps project, and I'm going to be showing off some Terraform that actually, activates an API and does some stuff. and theoretically, we could use this for a network, but we'll be getting to this later on. But this repeatability, automation, agility, scalability, reassurance refers to documentation, right? And then disaster recovery, that's the big one. But these benefits of infrastructure as code are applicable to the designs that you and I have come up with. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's good to have kind of like a goal of a design, I suppose, and these are great things to aspire to when you're designing a system in general. But yeah.
And so I think I kind of buried the lead on this list, right? So disaster recovery, theoretically, if there was a event in the cloud or an event on premise that the network fundamentally glitched to the degree that it was a disaster, right? You could reconfig all of those network devices in seconds, not hours, not minutes, but seconds, right? You could just push out, theoretically, you could just push out this disaster recovery scenario, and then the benefits of that are just tremendous, right? I mean, it doesn't get much better than that.
Yeah. I think with networking in particular is very interesting because I feel like it goes through cycles of like distributed control planes back to centralized control planes, and like where you put configuration, what the source of truth is, and that kind of thing. And I do a lot, what I like about the concept of GitOps, or the concept of like hosting configuration files, whether that's Ansible, Terraform, or however you're interacting with the devices themselves, having them in like a central repo is nice because you kind of separate out. So you still get the benefit of having a distributed control plane of all your network devices being independently, doing their own discovery and communicating over protocols, but you still get that centralized repository of like, here's where the state or my desired state of the network lives. And so yeah, to your point, you can plug and play, pull things out, put new things in. I mean, there's always nuance with hardware, and that's always something you have to tackle. But yeah, I totally agree with you. It's nice to have a central place or a central source of truth that you can deploy from, and it be in a reliable way that you can do over and over again, and not have to worry about it breaking stuff or what have you.
Source of truth is really the operative word, right? So in our designs, the Git repositories are the source of truth for the network, right? And there's a lot of power and a lot of advantages to modeling, and that is the correct verb, right? In infrastructure as code, the verb is to model. To model your infrastructure, your network, in configurations, in infrastructure as code, in a DSL, that stands for domain specific language, and or YAML, right, with Ansible, and then you have this model of the infrastructure, and the benefits are just tremendous.
Yeah, it's no, I totally agree. I mean, I've always heard debate too of like, especially with networking devices, of where the source of truth is, whether it's the running configuration on the device, whether it's some source repository, whether you're using GitHub or GitLab or Netbox or something like that to house it. But yeah, it's always interesting because it does come down to like a process driven decision of how easily, if you don't follow or you don't like lock things down and people go in there and do their cowboy thing and implement configs, it can get a little messy. But yeah, if you start off with a good foundation and kind of really stick to the intention of the design of the system you're building from a management perspective, then it takes a lot of work, but I think that at the end of it with the goals that you described from GitOps and all that kind of stuff is a good thing to achieve at the end of it.
So something we talked about in our pre-session is this idea of agile network, and I think it's really important to discuss, right? And so we have this software development tool, GitHub or GitLab, right? And you can use it to develop software very effectively and very efficiently with collaboration. And you can do things like CI/CD, which stands for continuous integration and continuous deployment. And you can build your software, you can test it, right? My GitOps has some tests for the Terraform, right, that I'm going to be showcasing today, and you can then deploy it, right? And that's really the kind of the critical part. You can get it out the door, and then with GitLab or GitHub, you have this project management capabilities. You have this ability in GitHub to specifically create issues and then organize them into a project, and you can manage the project, and you can manage what needs to happen with the software developers and with the database engineers and with the SecOps people. And I just wanted to kind of unwind that with you. For me, agile networking is the application of software best practices, namely agile software development via Scrum or what have you, and applying that to networking, right? And I think there's, I have this like very, very pronounced theory that it would be, super, super beneficial.
Yeah. No, I think I work with a lot of customers who deploy Agile in different capacities. But the idea that I never had when I was in a network engineering role is we never had the concept of sprints or the concept of time boxes for work to be done. It was always project-based or reactionary-based were the two most often the time that I would be in. Either you have a project that's a long-term and then it ends. Maybe it's an upgrade of everything, or maybe it's a replacement of devices, or you're reacting to outages. So it didn't really lend itself to having that continuous idea of improvement of the environment. It was mostly just once I finish this project, I'll move on to the next one. But it is nice to have kind of a defined methodology of here's what we're going to, here's our bucket list of issues. Some of them are user derived, some of them are feature requests, some of them are maintenance requirements. We're going to put them in a time box and like a sprint or a milestone type of from like an agile terminology perspective. And then we're going to go through and see how much we can complete. And then the next iteration of that, we're going to see what we did last time and use that to determine what we think we can do the next time. And it kind of creates this, instead of having all these projects with start and end dates, it creates this continuous work that you're doing to improve the resilience of your network environment or your infrastructure that you're managing, which is, I think, is a much better way of looking at it versus, all right, I've completed my upgrade of devices. Let's not touch them until we have to. I think the continuous monitoring, continuous work on something is always going to make it a little more sustainable over time.
Oh, I think that it's really lovely, and I really connected with a couple of things you said just now. And one thing that struck me is that that kind of focus, right? And that focus on the networking, and networking is fundamentally different than software development. And the example I always give for that is like if you're a software developer and you're building software and you make a mistake, you just fix it in the next version. And, like it's not true for network engineers, right? Network engineers get fired if they make a mistake. Like,
yeah. When you hit
fundamentally a different role.
Yeah, you hit enter and like the thing stops blinking and you can't type anything. It's not a good.
Yeah,
it's not
yeah, not a good look, right? On your you push out a big config and at the core switch and then it takes it out and you mess up the VLANs, But I think that brings up one of the most important aspects I think of this kind of approach that we're talking about, and it's testability, right? And when I talk to people about testability, I talked about it with Eric Chu, excuse me, Chow, the network automation nerd fellow. We very quickly brought up digital twins, right? And one of those benefits I talked about of infrastructure as code, specifically for GitOps, is you have this repeatability, right? So you can't, like, I wouldn't even attempt to create a digital twin network without configuration management, right? I wouldn't even attempt to it, because like how do you even approach that, right? And then if you have this digital twin, now you can have a digital triplet, right? Then you can have a digital quadruplet. You have this repeatability, and those are two of the benefits. Yeah, exactly. But I was just kind of curious if you had any other kind of thoughts about like maybe those differences between agile networking and agile software development, or is there anything else there that you want to bring up?
I mean, I think fundamentally there is a lot more nuance in networking from this perspective, just because you are reliant somewhat on the vendors that you choose and the tools and APIs they provide for you to work against. Whereas if you're a developer, kind of the world is your oyster, and you can kind of do whatever you can imagine and try to make that happen. Your constraints are a lot less from the perspective of how you're managing that workflow. Whereas with networking, you are kind of at the decision of how efficient your network automation journey is going to be sort of starts with the vendors that you choose, and how you're going to discern the segregation of your network and how you're going to classify things. So there's a lot of pre-work just to make it manageable after the fact once you start deploying an automation strategy. Whereas with software development, I think that it could be a little more free form in the beginning. You can start with an MVP, a minimum viable product, and you can kind of build on it from there. Whereas with networking, it's thought of as a commodity service. Most people don't think about, oh, I'm so happy this network works well. They only think about it when it doesn't work. And so you can't exactly come up with an MVP and then improve on it. You kind of have to start out with something that is reliable and robust, and then deploy your management on top of that to make it more efficient from your perspective. So yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance just because of how nitty gritty networking can be versus software engineering or software development practices, I think.
I think that's a fantastic point, man. Thank you. I hadn't gotten there in my thinking, just the required planning and stuff. It is fundamentally different. But what we're saying is take the best principles, right? And this will be the last thing I say on this topic before your demo. But something I am very, very critical of, and not critical, that's the right word, but something I'm very specific about is that you really should be trying in network automation. You should be trying to automate 80% of the toil. And I know you said you love those kind of beanbag sections, but I do not, right? I do not at all, right? So my whole dream, my whole goal for automation, and I'm currently employed at SUSE, the Linux company, and that type of activity where you're automating systems, in particular Unix systems. There's a lot of toil. You bootstrap a VM and then you wait and then you run your Ansible script and then it doesn't work and then you shut it down and you fix it and you run it. And so these automation activities can be very, very tedious, right? And that's what I'm suggesting is that you get rid of 80% of the toil so that you as a network engineer can focus on the 20% most high value, most interesting parts of your job, right? And I think that's a great sales pitch. How does that strike you?
No, yeah. I mean, I totally agree. I think that kind of made me think about what I just said about the MVP aspect of networking is you can do an AVP of like building out your management structure. You're building out like your GitOps or your agile networking. You can do that from an MVP perspective, but maybe not the network infrastructure itself. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that it is getting to a point where maybe you have a subset of your network. Maybe it's just a data center, a few racks in your data center that's kind of isolated to a particular application or something like that you're kind of bringing into this automation plane. The goal being that instead of working on or knowing about IP address management or interface specific configurations, you want to be able to look at it from like, this application needs this treatment of traffic. How do I provide that for them quickly? Or how do I improve their connectivity between nodes? Or how do I provide a new service through the network or what have you? But yeah, it's good to get your head out of the nuance or the minutia of like hardware level problems to figure out.
Oh, I love that. And so without further ado, I think the rest of the Streamcast, what we'll do is actually do a demo. I'll do my demo. Excuse me, you'll do your demo and and how do you, and I know the Git lab repo is named DC Corp, and and so should we call your project DC Corp, or do you have a different name for it?
No, I just called it that just as like to kind of give an idea of like within this. I don't think you'll ever be in a situation where you'll have your entire network within a single project or a single repository. I think that what you'll have is several projects that treat different devices or different segments of your network differently. And so that was just the idea of like, this will be an example of like a small data center. You'll have this project houses this particular set of configurations that this team perhaps manages in specific. So yeah, that's
a great point. And so I've come to the same conclusion with GitOps. Like GitOps will be made up of many different repositories for different functionality and feature, right? Like this idea that your network is going to be in a mono repo, which I believe is an anti-pattern. And by the way, it's hard to kind of instrument in GitHub Actions, right? So you have all this Terraform code, for example, and like descending into the Terraform code to find the right Terraform script to run is actually complicated. It's much more simple to have these specific repos, right? And so I came to the same conclusion. Yeah. Without further ado, are you open to sharing your and presenting your demo?
Yeah. Let me make sure. I'll just do the entire screen. All right. Cool. Can you see that all right?
Just fine.
Okay, cool. So this is and I do have to say this now that I'm showing GitLab is that the opinions are of mine. These are not opinions of GitLab or anything like that. This is just a personal thing that I've set up for demonstration purposes. But yeah, so what this is, you're looking at just like the GitLab UI, and here I have a kind of just a demonstrative example, kind of the art of the possible, so to speak, of how you can do this. So in this, I have some configurations, a very small little 2 router configurations with some BGP configs in them. So I have 2 routers that are connected through a single interface, and there's a BGP adjacency shared between them. So very, very simple, just to demonstrate kind of what would look like to make changes. These are running free range routing, so I have my daemons and stuff set up here as well. Not as important to it. And then I have a series of scripts and such here. In fact, I'll look at the web ID. It would be a little bit easier. So the first benefit, I think, is that I come from like a Notepad++ world, right, where I just had a bunch of tabs open in Notepad++, and I'd be just copying and pasting stuff around. Moving over to more of a developer mindset or developer work environment gives you the ability to use IDEs or things like VS Code or something like that, where you have a little more defined area where you're doing your work for network engineering, developing new designs or implementing changes. So within here, I have not only my configurations that I just showed, but I also have a series of scripts. I have my pipeline definition. This is going to determine when I make changes, what sort of automation actually kicks off. I have different topologies for Container Lab, which is what I'm using to emulate my environment, and all sorts of stuff. And I'll show you what that looks like in practice. So,
excuse me, Billy, could you define Container Lab?
Say again?
Sorry, could you define Container Lab? I think that's an important piece of the
infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yeah, Container Lab is essentially, well, actually, I'll show it in a second. I think it'd be better if I'll just show it
Sure.
what it looks like, what my environment looks like. But yeah, it's what I'm using for labbing. And all of these pieces that I'm using are also interchangeable because, again, going back to that point where sometimes you're a little bit beholden to the vendors or the devices that you're using, you might be forced to use a certain emulation engine or something like that based on your vendor because maybe, Container Lab doesn't support it or GNS3 or something like that. But anyways, going back to the workflow, I'm a network engineer. I've come in here. I want to do some work on something. The first thing we do is like what you were saying with agile networking or agile software development is we start with defining the problem that we want to actually tackle. Within GitLab, you can do that within epics for like multi-team initiatives. But in here, I just have a few issues that I'm created. So this is where I would start creating my list of problems that I want to tackle at some point. These can be generated by project managers or product manager, whoever, as part of the planning portion of this. I can develop issue boards and kind of have Kanban boards, do all of that fun stuff as far as where the tasking actually lives. But the main power with this is when I start creating what are called merge requests. So just for context, so if you look at like my project, I have this main branch here. This main branch is a reflection of what's deployed in, say, my production environment, right? So I don't want to make changes directly to this main branch because that will directly impact my production environment because that's where this is my source of truth. So when I make changes to this environment, what I want to do is create merge requests. And so what I'm doing that is I'm creating an ephemeral branch or a short-lived branch within Git, which means that I'm creating a little a separate branch or a separate line that I'm pushing these configurations on or changing, and it's running through pipelines, it's doing automation testing, it's deploying to a Container Lab environment, which is like my ephemeral environment or my test environment. And this is where I kind of build out the change advisory board. I'm used to love going through the process of having to submit all of my changes to configuration in a Word doc and have to go to a meeting with people and have to explain the changes to a bunch of other stakeholders who don't really know or care unless it affects their system. This is kind of like codifying that process. So in this merge request, I have this ephemeral environment. I can make some changes in here. So if I wanted to make change, for example, I would do the same thing I just did. I would open up my web IDE. I'd come in here. I would change the configuration. I would add new things based on whatever was described in the planning issue that we just looked at. So in this example, all I'm doing in this case is I'm commenting out a BGP neighbor. So this is just to simulate, maybe I've broken something on accident. I wasn't aware of it. And I've also gone through and added a GitLab token. So this is a secret that I've added in here. So this is to simulate like maybe someone accidentally adds a password, or something along those lines. So as I'm making these changes, the first point of collaboration is that anybody can come in here and review this and say, hey, this might break something or something along those lines, and they can start a thread on this. And now I can start having conversations with people directly in my configuration and have all this stuff documented for historic reasons and look back on it, why we made certain decisions or what conversations were had. And those show up, obviously here within the merge request. But as I'm making these changes, every time I commit a new change to this branch, which is not affecting my main branch, a pipeline kicks off. So if I look at this pipeline and what's actually occurring here, this is the core of the automation of this whole process. First, I have what are called stages. So this is ran sequentially, and you can dictate what happens in concurrency and what happens sequentially based on any sort of dependencies. But in this case, I have a bunch of security scanning that's happening. If you have like Ansible or Terraform, you can do scanning on that, secret detection. I have some Python in this project, so I'm doing semgrep SAS scanning on that. Linting of my configurations to make sure that And this would be, again, dependent on the vendor that you're using, if there's a linting tool for that. The cool one here is incorporating something like Batfish for data modeling, or actually being able to take the configurations of your devices, which in this case, I just have my raw configurations. So from like an MVP perspective, you can start without having to get on full board with Ansible or Terraform or what have you. You can just start storing straight configuration files in and still get a lot of the benefits of automation and what have you from a testing perspective. So what I'm doing here is I'm running a Batfish test where it takes my configuration, it's modeling the network without deploying it anywhere, and then I can query that model. And so in this case, what I'll show you is that I'm querying it to see how many BGP relationships exist if I make this particular change. Then it goes through another check. Again, I work in public sector, so there's a lot of STIGs, if you're familiar with DISA STIGs or NIST 853 controls. I have a series of scripts. This is an example to go through my configuration to see, do my configurations still meet the requirements for these STIGs? And I can go and check those all off. And if one of them fails, I can kind of revert, go back to the drawing board, figure out what I need to change that within this branch and iterate over until I have what I want. And then finally, I go through building my lab environment. So this will be using Container Lab, and I'll show you that in just a second. So the result of that, of that pipeline, is that I have within this merge request is where all that information is summarized to me. So I have all the results of those different scans. So I have the results of those tests that I was doing, those like security tests or whatever sort of configuration tests you want to do, and I can see the result. Maybe in this case, I accidentally enabled IPv6. I wasn't supposed to, but now that's failing. And so now if someone comes in here, so hypothetically, I, who created this, should not be able to push this to the main branch and therefore to production. There would be some sort of hierarchy of someone else who has to approve my changes. So in this case, I have this approval aspect here, and this is very similar to a change advisory board. All your stakeholders who would have to approve changes to the environment should be invited to these merge requests so that everyone from different disciplines can discuss the changes, understand based on the results of testing what they're signing off on, and then go through and alert their approvals to this. But more from the result of that testing, you can see here from the Batfish test, I see now that I have 0 BGP relationships established, which makes sense because I removed the BGP statement. It noticed that I did put a secret in there, so it caused a critical finding to flag up for me adding a secret to this repository, and so on and so forth. And going back to Container Lab, essentially what I've done here is I've created this test environment. Now this is associated with a GitLab environment, which is an actual, a GitLab feature that anytime you deploy a new environment, it creates, a history, a historical ledger of all the different environments you've created. These are all of my testing environments that I've created. You can also do this with your production environments. And in my case here, so I have this, and now say I'm an engineer, I'm reviewing this change from someone else who posed it, and now I can actually access this. And in my case, Container Lab is just a network emulation software that in this case is using containers to run network operating systems on a GitLab runner. So this is a very simplistic way of doing it, but essentially I have 2 containers that are running, and they're running the operating system of FRR routing or free range routing with the configurations that I made, including the changes that I made. So if I do something like Docker exec, I'll do this guy, and I want it to be interactive. I'll put the container name, and I'll do here. Now I'm logged into this router, which is running in a container, but I can still see my configuration. I can see BGP statements that I've made. I have no BGP, just like we confirmed with my Batfish queries on that model. If I go log into the other router, the same thing. But I can see that it does have, it's attempting to create an adjacency because the configuration I didn't change on this side, but it's still active. So obviously there's nothing established there. But the point here is that I now have this environment that as soon as I merge that merge request into the main branch, this environment will be destroyed, and it's a short-lived environment. That's the intention of it, is that I have somewhere I can actually test these changes to not have to fully rely on automation or whatever, have another second guess where you can kind of play with it, get a real feel of what changes you're making. And that's where some of the nuance comes in as well that I mentioned. Like you're kind of beholden to your vendors and what they offer from an automation perspective, or an emulation, perspective. Like if you're using Cisco's tool for emulation, you can still sync that to an environment and have it linked to that and deploy the configs there. If you're using GNS3 or if you're deploying to a physical set of boxes that you have because you just have enough equipment to emulate your environment, or to simulate in that case. And yeah, so going forward, going down here, I have all my approvals made, the different people who are involved approve that. And then I would go here. I have unsolved threads here, so I'll go ahead and resolve this thread. And once I go ahead and do that, I can now merge this into my main repository. And in this case, once I merge this, now it's going to be the changes that I made will now be part of my main branch. And a second pipeline will kick off to deploy that. And we can see that being kicked off right here. And now this second pipeline is still going to run through scans and everything like that. And those scans are going to report any findings into a vulnerability dashboard, which is a GitLab specific thing. And then it's going to deploy that to wherever my production environment is that I'm trying to emulate in this whole workflow. So yeah, that kind of sums it up as an idea of how you can go from just having your network configurations living in Git, having the benefits of repeatability because you're using pipelines to automate the deployment of your configuration, to test the deployment of configuration. You have scalability in that this can span across tons of different projects. Tons of people can come in the same project and introduce their own ideas. You can discuss things and make changes and iterate through them. And to your original point about disaster recovery, I still have this central point of control or management plane that houses my source of truth for configuration. So if I need to replace devices, as long as they have management connectivity back to wherever my runners live from a GitLab perspective, then I can always reconfigure those devices appropriately and bring them back into my fabric as needed. But yeah, so that's kind of everything that I had to show from this. Again, it's kind of an idea of the art of the possible in a lot of ways, and that how you can go from having network configuration stored in Git, build an automation engine around that, and codify that process of change control. From ideation of figuring out what we want to change to defining where it needs to go and how it needs to be done to deploying it into your environment and getting getting the benefit of a source of truth within all of that.
Well, I have to say, well done, Billy. That was a tremendous demo. You really, cobbled together something really quite excellent. I'm particularly struck by the the container lab aspect of it. I wanted to discuss that. With GitOps, one of the kind of focuses has been on installing a Kubernetes cluster inside your management LAN, right? And then the Kubernetes cluster reaches back to GitHub and then pulls down the run. And so the the Kubernetes cluster in your management LAN is running the GitHub Actions controller, which is a piece of software you install inside the Kubernetes cluster that communicates back to the GitHub site to pull down the images. And then, so let's say it's like a Terraform image, or it's an Ansible image, or it's a Postman image, or it's a bespoke Python code, or whatever it is. It downloads it and then it runs it inside your management network. And then what's one of the really kind of critical pieces of using Kubernetes for this is the reliability, the high availability, and the ability to scale, right? So you could scale up and have a container, running Terraform or running Postman or running Ansible for every network device in your network, right? And so you have this ability to make these configuration changes on a wide scale. But what you've done, if I understand correctly, is you're using Container Lab as a test harness, which is brilliant. And you mentioned that you're running it in the GitLab runner, right? So you installed the container as part of your script, your GitLab-ci.yaml script, and you're installing the Container Lab inside there. And what was the name of the project? It was the router that you're using. It was a Container Lab that I didn't recognize. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, the routers themselves are just running FRR. It's just an open source.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and so this testability in your infrastructure is just tremendous. And so while you were talking, I forked your DC Corp repo, right? And so now that if you go to gitlab.com/McGonagle/DC Corp, you can find Billy's. But now what I've done is I forked your project. It's open source, I assume, right? It is, yeah. And so now I have a copy of it, and so now I can start leveraging this this Container Lab. I assume they're called dev containers from Microsoft, but I assume it's something similar. It's the same thing that you're running or is it just a straight runner running a Docker container? Do you know?
Yeah, so you can do it. You can do it a myriad of ways. So probably the more scalable way to do it would be to have your runner live in Kubernetes, like you were saying with GitHub Actions. And then you can also run Container Lab in Kubernetes. It's called Kubernetes. It's kind of like it's a
Yeah, I've noticed that
point of it. So you can have your runner, which is your runner is essentially taking those tasks or those jobs. It's cloning your repository. You're running all your tests or whatever, and then it's deploying those configurations. So in this case, like the two containers that I showed you that are running on that VM, that is also a GitLab runner. So same premise, but just different compute resources that I'm using, a VM versus Kubernetes. I didn't create any of that. All that stuff was happened. My runner initiated the commands to build out the Container Lab environment based on the configurations within my repository. So I didn't have to go through and deploy any containers. I didn't have to manually import configurations. That was all done as part of the sequence of steps within the pipeline.
Got it. I'm looking through your Container Lab build steps, right? Like in GitHub, they're called steps.
Yep.
Yeah, and so you're how does the networking work from GitLab? Oh, it's all within that GitLab container. I mean, GitLab runner, right? So you're just the management interface of the RTR, excuse me, the FRR is just accessible, right? Because it's all happening on the same virtual machine runner, right?
In my case, for the sake of simplicity, so I'm using a VM in DigitalOcean, which I've installed the runner on, and I'm using what's called a shell runner. So I'm basically, the runner is controlling the VM completely. It's not deploying it, it's not running in a container or anything like that, but it's actually a process running on that VM. And so that's kind of like my agent, so to speak, that GitLab is using to invoke all of these tasks that you'll see within the pipeline itself. So in that case, I'm using them like I have a personal runner set up. So if you fork the project, you won't have access to that same runner, obviously.
Got it.
But that would be, so I'm not using GitLab infrastructure. You could use GitLab infrastructure and you would use something like Docker and Docker. And then you'd have a Docker image running Container Lab. And inside that Docker image will be running sub processes of your routers. I don't know how the networking could get a little wonky on that, I would imagine. But
yeah,
I know
that's something I've encountered. The networking gets wonky. It gets difficult. But when you said you're just hosting it in DigitalOcean, that makes a lot more sense. I got it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So just to let you know, so I know I mentioned earlier that I was planning on doing a demo of GitOps. I don't think it's necessary. I think your demo is so similar to conceptually to what I'm trying to do with GitOps. I think we just stick with your demo and we'll just showcase your demo as part of this StreamCast, and we'll just stick with that. But to tie up the StreamCast, I was hoping to kind of dig into Kubernetes with you and Kubernetes and I'm going to look at the show notes. I just want to make sure I'm on track. And coaching, right? And so maybe we'll start with coaching. I know in your role at GitLab, I assume it's a very coaching oriented role, right? Like you're coaching the customers every day, right? Is that right?
Yeah. Coaching is probably one way to maybe put it. I don't know. I think it's more so I'm kind of there as sometimes a sounding board, sometimes to provide, how would we recommend doing things, provide opinions from the vendor, so to speak, helping them like understand new things that are coming out and our intended use case behind them. But yeah, it's more so like I'll try to understand what they're trying to accomplish and where I can help them accomplish that, either using GitLab or using another tool, because sometimes GitLab isn't the right tool for everything, obviously. But yeah, that's kind of a post-sales consultative type of role in a lot of respects. Yeah.
Well, was your most impactful coaching experience, was that in the military? Was that as a Marine, or did you have other coaching experiences that were really positive or negative, or?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if I've ever really classified any roles I've had as like coaching, I guess. I don't know if it has been.
I mean, as a mentee, as someone being coached, I for example, I played sports. I was a football player for 8 years. I played in college, and it was and I wrestled, right, and I boxed, and I had wonderful coaches, right, and so I really look at coaching through this lens. And I was just curious if you've had any really kind of positive experiences. I know it's a very difficult question. I'm really kind of putting you on the spot,
I think at my last company that I used to work for, it's a company called Sterling. We did this I thought it was really cool at the time, where we had this group, a team that I was on, that we're kind of in charge of, learning new technology and trying to describe how beneficial it is to like our customer base at the time, and kind of doing road shows and like
Sure.
we did these 4-hour like workshops, and my responsibility was Kubernetes on these workshops. So I would travel around to different customer sites or different like organizations within the government or elsewhere and do like these 4-hour workshops on just, you don't know anything about Kubernetes, let's spend the next 4 hours, and like I have labs built out.
Oh my.
And it was great. I really enjoyed it. It just because, and it's from a coaching perspective, I enjoyed going back to like the superpower thing, I guess. I'm just into it. I'm passionate about it. So like, it's kind of fun to sit and talk about this stuff and hear other people that are interested in it and hear their thoughts on it, or hear their perspectives that are different from mine, and all that kind of stuff. So like, yeah, that experience of just getting thrust into like, hey, you come up with 3 or 4 hours of content to explain from an operator's perspective, Kubernetes to a group of people and make it worthwhile.
Was it a network engineering audience, or was it outside of network engineering?
It was very mixed. Sometimes we had a few developers in there. Sometimes we had application owners. I would say very rarely we would have network engineers. Oftentimes, that group would like, hey, that's not part of our initiative kind of thing. But I think that is slowly changing. I think, we talk about network automation and the nuance of like vendor specifics and all that kind of stuff. If you start getting into like automating Cilium on Kubernetes and stuff like that, it gets to be even more similar to the developer lifecycle than what I just showed. So I definitely think that's like the road ahead is especially with, Cisco acquiring Isovalent, the guys behind Cilium. Like, I think that's going to be a big change coming in the near future, is incorporating network engineers and like the methodology of that into Kubernetes and that software ecosystem a little bit more.
That's a great point. I didn't actually think of that, but I do have a comment about that. So, the last thing I want to talk to you about today is the need, quote unquote, for network engineers to learn Kubernetes, right? And like Scott, like I've been interacted with a number of network engineers recently, and they're like, oh, something else to learn, which is valid, right? It is valid, but I take a very kind of harsh stance on it, man. Like, I've had to retool in my career like every year, 2 years, throughout. I have a 25-year career, right? I've been doing it for 25 years, and like the networking in Kubernetes. And you mentioned Isovalent and EBGP, eBPF. Excuse me. Well, not BGP, eBPF, the Berkeley Packet Filter, and the complexity in Kubernetes for the networking side is very, very difficult. And I've personally noticed that a lot of developers are uncomfortable with it. And I think there's an opportunity for network engineering to step up and be the network guys for these complex, multi-cloud environments and all that stuff that goes along with it. But what it was really kind of, I'm kind of rambling at this point, but what I was really trying to focus on was, what does that look like for you in terms of network engineers learning Kubernetes? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, well, I think there's this really good book that I read. It's called Platform Systems or Platform Strategy by Gregor Hope. He was like, work at AWS as some high-level architect. He does a lot to talk about it, but this book is really good about like systems thinking and understanding like design of a platform and like the trying to gain the idea of like what you're actually trying to accomplish. So I say that to say the need of learning Kubernetes, I think, is less important than the need of learning how systems are organized and how to design efficient systems. And if you're a network engineer, you already have a lot of practice designing distributed systems, which is frankly the hard part, I think, for a lot of large scale applications, is understanding how to design a distributed system. And Kubernetes just comes in as like an awesome management plane for that, or a set of controllers to help you design efficient systems, regardless of what the use case is. So to answer your question, I don't know if I would say like every network engineer would have to learn Kubernetes unless it approached them or their company started adopting it or what have you. But I do think that everyone should spend time understanding systems thinking and understanding why is Kubernetes so popular now and what problems is it solving, and how you can maybe use some of those concepts in your day-to-day. And if that's a road that leads you to deploying something in Kubernetes and going that route, then that's perfect. But it could lead you somewhere else and designing a different system that suits your needs.
So I am totally connecting with what you said. I think it's actually quite brilliant. And thank you for sharing the book title and the book by Greg Hope. I grabbed it on Amazon. I'll include it in our show notes. I think it's a great resource
Awesome.
for people. And I was a little bit surprised. So I've been a systems thinker, practicing systems thinker every single day, whether in my personal or professional life, since undergrad. So my bachelor's and my master's degree are in systems thinking, believe it or not. And
Yeah.
I've focused on it ever since. And by definition, network engineering is practical systems thinking. And I only realized that like this last year. I was kind of Googling around and came across this definition of systems thinking. And network engineering is probably the biggest discipline for of systems thinking, believe it or not, out of the kind of the IT paradigms, right? And so I just found that personally very, very interesting.
Distributed
I,
control is not easy, I think.
it's not right. And so, with systems thinking, the methodology that I use is DSRP, and it's distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives, right? And so you kind of are constantly thinking about all the distinctions and the differences and the systems and their relationships and their perspectives of the different people. And, and you're always kind of keeping this in your mind. You're thinking about all the different components. And that is an exercise in network engineering, right? That is truly network engineering. And I think your demo today of DC Corp scream systems thinking, right? You're thinking about all the different systems and all the different perspectives and the relationships specifically, right? That came across to me. And so your advice to concentrate on systems thinking as a tip of the spear for Kubernetes, I think is marvelous. I really connected with that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, man. I think, I mean, that's what led me to going from, and not that this is a path that it's just kind of the path that I found myself on, but going from like in the trenches, network engineering, like, I worked at like somewhat similar to an ISP over in the Middle East for years. And I was doing like MPLS backbone type stuff, like very nitty gritty in the weeds, to now I work at a software development company. It's like very two different worlds, but the path that I got there is very connected. And it started with network engineering and systems design, and kind of just the same concepts apply. I was just talking to some of our SRE managers at GitLab. So I think that's gonna be my next step, is getting to SRE type roles, which I think is exactly the same as network engineering, just with different systems. But the whole idea is that
agreed.
Thinking is the same across the board.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm gonna call it a wrap. We were shooting for like 45, and I think we got all the way up to 52.
Yeah.
And so I can't thank you enough. I'm struck by how similar our thinking is on so many different topics. It's really been a pleasure. That I want to thank you personally for reaching out, and then being on K8sKoach. It's really a pleasure, Billy. And once again, wonderful job on the demo. You did a phenomenal job. And so I'm just going to wrap it up, and we're going to call it a day. And if you could just stick around for a minute, I wanted to just ask you a follow-up question, and I'm just going to shut down the stream. Thanks again, Billy. It's been a true pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, before I go, Billy, is there anything you want to socialize? I forgot to ask you that. Is there anything out there that you want to socialize?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if I I reached out to you because I heard you on Packet Pusher. So if anybody hears this and wants to reach out and talk about it, I mean, you can always find me on LinkedIn. Reach out if you have questions about it or anything like that.
Perfect. Thank you.